Hello, dear readers, viewers, and subscribers of our social media platforms. Today, my dear friend and esteemed guest is with us, Mr. Mark Reese. He is an American researcher of Central Asia and a specialist in the culture of Uzbekistan. Mark translated into English the novel Bygone Days by Abdulla Qodiriy, one of the most important works of Uzbek literature. He studies Islamic tradition, performs namaz himself, and is well acquainted with the regional specifics of Islam in Uzbekistan. A special focus of his research is women's dance as a form of cultural and spiritual memory of the Uzbek people. Mark collaborates with ethnomusicologist Laurel Victoria Gray and is translating her book into Uzbek. He deeply studies Jadidism, the reformist ideas in the Muslim world, as well as questions of identity and the cultural heritage of Uzbekistan. For Mark, Uzbekistan is not just a country, it is a full-fledged civilization with its own unique cultural code. In the past, he worked in the Peace Corps in Uzbekistan, taught at universities in the United States, and collaborated with academic centers in the fields of Islamic studies and regional research. My dear friend Mark, welcome.
Thank you very much. Yes, 30 years. This September will be 31. Inshallah, I'll see 40 and 50 years of experience with Uzbekistan. It's been most of my life, starting at the age of 24. I came to Uzbekistan as a Peace Corps volunteer, as you mentioned, and I was assigned to the city of Tashkent in the Fergana Valley. So, as you all know, in 1994, the only maps we had of Uzbekistan was from the Soviet Union. We had no dictionaries in the Uzbek English. We just didn't understand the region. It was a new republic. And so it was a great opportunity for me. It changed my life. It gave me a faith. I said the Shahada in Kokan in 1995 during Hayat. I kind of consider myself a cowboy Sufi, but it gave me a faith. My wife is from Tashkent. So I tell my son all the time, Michael, you're part Russian, you're part Uzbek, you're part German, you're part Welsh. So Uzbekistan has given me my whole life. And if I was to boil down the culture of Uzbekistan, which is, I think, what we've been trying to do for 30 years, ever since independence, is to try to explain to other people what is Uzbekistan, what is an Uzbek, what is a Tajik, what is a Russian, what is an Armenian? What is a Jew? I see Uzbekistan as, this will be a challenge to translate maybe, as an ecumenical world. A world where Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam have all come together to form these different identities. And to me, as a kid, in his 20s from Arizona. I was Decon, I grew up in cotton fields in Arizona. It was just this incredible adventure for me. And so, at 56 years old, I'm still trying to understand Uzbekistan. And it's been a really great journey for me.
Thank you, Mark. You have translated Qodiriy. For you, is his text just a novel, or is it also a coded warning about a break with tradition?
I love the question. Thank you, Fergana. That's a great question. The NKVD did not kill Qodiriy because of a love story. But the love story between Kamush and Otabek is political, in that they married out of love. They married against tradition of Uzbek OEM wanting to find his son a mate, a wife that is suitable, that she's been waiting since the moment he was born. So there's so many layers to the novel. I think, in my opinion, Qodiriy was writing a novel about the past to describe his future as a warning. Let me rephrase, sorry. It's a novel about the past to describe his present life of situation of the 1920s in Turkestan as a warning to future generations.
Mm-hmm.
When he writes Yusuf Chidan at the beginning of the novel, he's speaking to you. He's speaking, dear reader. He doesn't know who the reader will be. When you write a book, you're writing a book for generations to pick up. You never know who is going to read it. So what was powerful to me about Bygone Kunlar was when Qodiriy speaks directly to me. It's very emotional for me, very powerful. He died in 1938, along with the Jadids. I think he understood that at some point his writing could get him killed. And so he gave his life. The Jadids gave their lives so that President Mirziyoyev could do reform. We could have this republic. So for me in 1994, I had more questions than answers after Peace Corps. To me, Bygone Kunlar answers many of the questions that I had about Uzbek culture and Kokan. So tradition, I think Qodiriy challenges the definition of what it means to be Uzbek.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and then in the 20s, they're forming this idea of a modern Uzbek language, a modern Uzbek republic. You have Ustalim, who's a Sufi,
Mm-hmm.
in my opinion, in the novel. He's Naqshbandiya. Okay.
Yes.
And then you have his father, Yusuf Bek Haji, who's part of the ulema. So Otabek is like all of us going through life. Okay, Ustalim likes to drink a little bit of wine, maybe too much. Yusuf Bek Haji understands Sharia. He understands Islamic law, and we're going through this world trying to understand. So powerful to me is that Qodiriy speaks to us, and he gives us this, we understand Otabek as an autobiography of Abdulla Qodiriy. Mm-hmm. So you're understanding, through understanding Otabek, you're understanding Qodiriy and how he managed to deal with his world. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you, Mark. My next question is about embodied memory and the feminine code. You have said that dance is an archive that cannot be burned. Could you elaborate on this idea?
So that's actually Laurel Victoria Gray's main idea, and that I think it's a gorgeous definition of dance.
Mm-hmm.
The KGB, the NKVD in the 1920s, 30s, they can burn a book. You can burn a book. You can kill an author, right? You can kill millions of people in the 1920s and 30s. But dance is something that a mother, one of the things I love about Uzbekistan are the oy mullahs. When they do Holton Osh, they're teaching their kids and generations a language. Dance is language. And in that language is something that you can't burn. You can't destroy. You every time you have a toy, every time you have New Year's, every time you have Nowruz or Haid, and somebody dances a little bit, you're telling your kids a story, and it cannot be burned. It cannot be destroyed.
Dear Mark, I would like to ask you a question. In Sufi tradition, the body is not just flesh, it is a path. In your opinion, to what extent does Uzbek dance preserve the Sufi experience of being? I ask this because an Azerbaijani dancer, Amina Abilbazi, made a significant contribution to Uzbek dance art. Do you think there is a Sufi experience of being within these dance traditions, or not?
Without doubt, it embodies a Sufistic experience in that, a year ago, I went back to Kokand, and my friend Rashad Mavlankulov, who is the director of Hudurahan Museum in the museums in Kokand, gave me this tour. And I said, give me the three most important places in Kokand you want to show me.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very touched. The last place we went to was the Hanukkah for the Mavlankulov family, and how they had this very important Sufi family from Kokand had to navigate repression in the 20s and 30s. And so if we tie the idea that dance is an archive that cannot be burned from Laurel Victoria Gray, and we tie that to the idea of Sufism, the Mevlevi in Konya, we call them dervishes, but the Mevlevi,
Yes, yes.
the language of dance is a way of becoming closer to God, becoming closer to the Maulana. And so, without a doubt that there's a significant tie. It's also a way, dance is also a way, to do Sufistic practices and not be repressed, and to express yourself for society in a way that may have been a little bit more tricky in the 20s and 30s and in the Soviet period.
Thank you, Mark. My next question. Is your path to understanding Islam part of academic inquiry or a personal return?
Little of both. I was invited for Hayat in Kokand in 1995 in Yangi Juma Masjid. It's now a museum in Kokand, unfortunately. I wish they would make it a masjid again. But I went there with my host family. They taught me the kalima. They taught me how to pray, how to do namaz. And I have to say, it was the most significant spiritual moment of my life.
Mm-hmm.
The moment during prayer when all of these men, this is 1995, after independence, people are allowed to do Islam openly without any repercussions. That's a debate, for that period. But at that time in 95, people were optimistic. And I got to see thousands of men into the streets across Hamza Park, all praying and all saying Omeen at the same time. And it was just this powerful moment for me. And so, Islam for me has always been a journey. Have I been perfect in practicing it? No. It's a part of learning. I don't drink alcohol. It's difficult for me in Uzbekistan because if an old man gives me a piola of vodka, it's very difficult for me to say no. In a Dabli, Aksakal, Soviet guy. So if I'm offered a toast, I might do a toast.
Uh-huh.
It's very difficult with Mehmoon Dost in Central Asia. I'm their guest. And Adabli, to be Adab, as I am a guest, I have responsibilities to my host.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to insult anybody. So as I learn about Islam, about the idea of not drinking alcohol, doing substances that control you and take away, make you aklsiz odam, that really appeals to me. The simplicity of it appeals to me. It's refined. An imam is anybody that the community decides upon to lead the prayer. I love the idea of ijma and the hadith that says that as a community, we cannot agree upon a mistake. That as a community, if we make a decision, it cannot possibly be a mistake. So it's interesting to me. I just ask that, as young men, especially in Uzbekistan, understand their own faith. I just ask them to have a compassionate form of Islam, a merciful form of Islam, because that's what that means to me. When I came back after 1 year in Peace Corps, I came back. I was thin. I went from this to this. Living in Uzbekistan, I was very healthy, but I was thin. And my mom said, "Mark, you're living in a Muslim town. What is it like? She's Catholic. What's it like living with Muslims?" I said, "Mom, uh, when I was hungry, people who didn't know me fed me. When I needed a home, people took me in like their own son." So that to me has always been Uzbekistan. That to me has always been the idea of the Islamic faith. And for me, my personal thing is the reason I'm so attracted to Sufism is not a hippy dippy American view of Sufism or Islam, but the idea of the Maulana, the Mevlevi, and Rumi, and this idea of peace, and the idea of understanding and acceptance and tolerance of other viewpoints.
Thank you, dear Mark. My next question. With your knowledge, how would you describe the difference between Islam in Fergana and Islam in Samarkand, Khiva, or Bukhara?
I understand the question. Yeah. So
Thank
I
you.
understand. I'm still studying. I'm still a student. To me, for 20 years, they were calling Fergana, fundamentalist Central Asia, Wahhabi Islam. I don't agree with any of that. I see the Fergana Valley as a conservative place of people who believe in what they believe, and they are willing to resist foreign occupation in order to express themselves. So Fergana to me has always been, you go through Fergana and you find all of these tombs to Sufi saints. You find the earliest bringers of Islam to Central Asia. In my field research, I went to Margalan to find Haji Magiza's tomb from Ukan Kunlar. And I didn't know if it was a real tomb or not from the novel Ukan Kunlar. And then I go to Margalan and I ask this man, I said, "Belasisma Ukan Kunlar Haji Magiza dedi Ozgan, or Haji Maaz, Nimana, Kaya de Joylashkan." And he showed it to me. He took me to
you were speaking Uzbek language.
Not bad, not bad. Yeah. So he took me to Haji Maaz, and I was very emotional because here is a place that Qodiriy himself went to. And near Haji Maaz's tomb is another tomb built by Utaboy Kushbegi, who was the Hakim of Margalan. So not only is it a tomb that Qodiriy went to with Haji Maaz, Utabek Kushbegi, a Kipchak tomb, is nearby.
Yes.
So there's so many, there's so many layers to all of this with Islam in Central Asia. Bizga Birhil, Bizga Harhil, Lakin Bizga Birhil. You can go to Karshi and you can see some Zoroastrian practices, picking the woman up, walking around the fire 3 times, is probably from Zoroastrianism. You can go to Samarkand and go to Shah Izinda, and women who want to have a baby will light a candle, and do a dua to have a baby. Bibi Hanum, women walking under the stone Quran, 3 times to get pregnant, to me, that is a very unique flavor of Islam that I think people around the world would be fascinated with. I just think that Uzbekistan, especially, tourism has a really big challenge of telling the story to travelers of what it is that travelers are looking at. You're patient with me with my long answer.
Thank you, dear Mark. You have probably seen the presentations of my documentary film. It hasn't been published yet. Jadidism is one of my favorite topics. In this regard, I would like to ask you, in your opinion, is Jadidism not only an educational project, but also a project of embodied culture?
Another great question. I've thought about this for decades. Uh, and I may offend some of the viewers on this one, but I say this huffable mind. For 20 years, we've been talking about Amir Timur. And of course, the Timurids, very important in human history. They created this efflorescence of culture that we still see today in India, in Pakistan, in southern Russia, all over the world, right? But I'm interested in models of leadership, ethical ideas that people can follow. And I don't think the idea of Amir Timur, he is the hero of Uzbekistan, but he was hundreds of years ago. Okay. Mm-hmm. So is a young man walking along his mahalla, what model of leadership is he going to draw upon? Okay. So with the Jadids, to me, they died in 1938. I'm friends with Abdulla Qodiriy, the grandson of Abdulla Qodiriy. I can meet the descendants of Abdulla Qodiriy and shake their hand and eat palav with them and get to know them, right? So to me, I call President Mirziyoyev the literary president. In my opinion, Hafizul Mind to Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, I think President Mirziyoyev, out of all of the Central Asian leaders, is the most literary president in Central Asian history.
Thank you.
Okay. Only Sharaf Rashidov, maybe. Not maybe. Only Sharaf Rashidov, I would say, who was a writer. He's carrying on that tradition. But by accepting Jadids, it's not just a cultural movement or educational movement. It's a model for leadership. This is what we believe in Uzbekistan.
Of course.
Right? So so he's been very successful. And, I went to the Jadid conference that Saida Mirziyoyev was giving a speech. And I'm an American. We smile a lot. And she was talking about Uzbek language reform. And she said a line that made me laugh out loud in this entire conference about Uzbek spelling that seems to change every 5 to 10 years. Okay. Mm-hmm. So, but I see with the president, he is telling the story of Uzbekistan. He is saying, this is what we believe in. Girls will be educated. Kundashlik mumkin emas. Buhana Amerikan, right? Corruptia. We're, these things are things that we believe in as the Republic of Uzbekistan. And so when a young man walks in the mahalla, he knows who his heroes are, right? Okay, Timur, 20 years ago, I understand after independence why Amir Timur was the obvious hero of independence. But the Jadids died in order to remember Amir Timur. They died in order to remember their heritage, right? Yes. And to define themselves. So I think that President Mirziyoyev is a Jadid. Of course he is. He is working to remember the heritage of the Republic of Uzbekistan. But because the Jadids died in 1938, they're more difficult. It's a more difficult political subject to have, discussion to have. So, but it's something that I, as an American, can understand. After 9/11, we built in America entire buildings to try to understand Islam. Okay. The role of women in Islam, the role of government in Islam. What is marriage? What is kundashlik? What is corruption? We built these entire departments to understand this, spent trillions of dollars. I think we could have just read Kunlar, to understand Uzbekistan better. So this is the big challenge of Uzbekistan still. And I'm honestly a bit frustrated with this, is that there's so much Uzbek literary heritage that needs to be translated from Uzbek into English, into French, Korean, Russian, Chinese. Uzbeks still struggle to tell their story. But I think that by acknowledging the Jadids as a model of leadership, of this is what we believe in, is both brave to do, very brave to do. And it gives a model of leadership that I can understand as an American. My big test on everything with Uzbekistan is my mother. She's a Southern lady, the daughter of an Air Force senior enlisted non-commissioned officer. She's traveled the world. She lived in London. She lived in Germany. She's a worldly woman, but she didn't know anything about Uzbekistan when I went in 1994. She didn't understand anything about it. So I've been explaining this to her for 30 years, why I keep going back to Tashkent. And so the book has been the way that I can explain, it in a way that she can understand as a modern American woman.
Thank you, dear Mark. My next question. You and I, as people living in the West, understand well that the world operates through signs, symbols, and messages. In this context, I would like to ask you, why do you think the Jadid project was interrupted but not erased? Where does it live today? In dance? In the diaspora? In you? Or perhaps in both you and me?
The answer to that is yes. I think that, Qodiriy and the Jadids deserve a place with William Faulkner, with Hemingway, with Shakespeare. I think when Chopin translated Othello into Uzbek, brilliant achievement. He understood that the concerns of Shakespeare are also our concerns. It's not about race or religion. It's not about politics. It's about human beings. When you kill a Kipchak for your career, says Qodiriy, it's wrong. It's haram. Just because he's a Kipchak, right? So he makes a statement that there's only one race. It's the human race. And good literature brings human beings together. So you have someone, an Uzbek kid in America growing up away from the Vatan. They may not know Uzbek, they may not know Russian, but they can read the Jadids in English and understand better that this is your heritage, that you need to have pride in this. I think a lot about this, Fikretika. Why did the Jadids survive? Why did the ideas survive? And I think that when you go through human history, history is ugly. Winston Churchill called history a record of man's indecency to man. And so what struck me very early on in Fergana and Kokand, people would say, oh, Kokand League, they speak Adabiyat Tila Gapradala. That Kokand League speak the purest Uzbek literary language from Nadira, from Umar Han. They're the great literary people. But when I would meet someone, they would say, ooh, Bu Kisha Jadid Tila Gapradala. Bu Kisha Jadid. I'm like, what is a Jadid? I'm a 25-year-old American guy who knows nothing about anything, and he's learning, right? So, why did those ideas survive? And maybe affable mind to people, Soviet ideas did not survive, right? It's because that is the market of ideas. Good ideas will survive. And you can kill as many people as you want, but those ideals will still persist among the human race because they're not specific to Uzbeks. Jadid ideas are not specific to Uzbeks or Turks or Persians or Arabs or Americans or Anglichani. These are universal ideas, and you can never crush truth. It will always survive.
Dear friend Mark,
Gap yo'q ekan.
very good. Gap yo'q. To'g'ri aytdingiz. Juda ham yaxshi. O'zbekcha gapiramizmi?
O'zbekcha gapiraman. Lekin men har kun gapirishim mumkin emas. AQShda shuning uchun ingliz tili gapirmoqchiman, chunki shunaqa fikrlari juda muhimdir. Lekin men bilamanki men
Mashallah, juda ham yaxshi gapiryapsiz aka.
My next question. We have been talking about the Jadids. The second part of my documentary film focuses on presenting Uzbekistan. In your opinion, Uzbekistan and its role in the world, can Uzbekistan offer the world an alternative model of civilizational renewal? I am now in Tashkent, in Uzbekistan. This is a very important question for me. I see a difference. I see a breakthrough happening.
Absolutely. And it already is. And, Uzbekistan's in a tough neighborhood. And so when I arrived in Uzbekistan in 94, there was a civil war in Tajikistan. There was a civil war in Afghanistan. There was a war in Chechnya. They were dangerous times. And so when I think about President Karimov, I try to be balanced in my analysis of the Karimov period, in that nobody gives you the manual on how to start a new republic.
Mm-hmm.
There's no book, that Islam Karimov could go to and say, how am I going to start a new independent republic of Uzbekistan? Right? Yeah. So nobody gives you directions on this, but he managed to keep war out of Uzbekistan. All right. I have many criticisms about human rights. Believe me, my feelings were hurt during the Karimov period. I couldn't go to Uzbekistan for many years, but okay. Hafabul man. But, so nobody gave him a manual on how to do this, right? Uzbeks always knew they were great. They always knew that there was a future. Kilajak, they always knew that there was a future. But how do we do it? And I think now that Uzbekistan now has experience. It's in a tough neighborhood. Geographically, China, India, Russia, Europe cannot ignore what Westerners called the spoke in the wheel of the Asian landmass. Mm-hmm. It's called Central Asia for a reason, right? It's central to Asia. So if China wants to go to Europe, they'll have to go through Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. If India, these overland transportation routes all go through Uzbekistan, through Kazakhstan, through Central Asia. In terms of a model for governance, in 2023, I was invited to be an observer at the presidential elections in Tashkent. And honestly, I was a little surprised, men tarjuma, but so, I went in 2023 because I wanted to make a statement that I believe in reform. I say to people who criticize reform, I say, you try it. You don't, just like independence, you don't get a manual for reform, right? It's going to take longer. But I also remember the 90s when Americans showed up to the former Soviet Union. My wife is a former Soviet. She's from Tashkent. Perestroika, very difficult period for Soviets. Independence, very difficult period for Soviets. And we show up, Americans and Brits and whatever, and start talking about, democratization. Insoning hukuklare, all of these different ideas, and we were very heavy-handed with it, and people were just trying to eat, Islam Karimov was just trying in those early years, just trying to keep Republic from not becoming Afghanistan, right? So to me, I went in 2023 to lend support, but I also said, as Americans, if we expect American style democracy in Uzbekistan, we're wrong. We're wrong. Uzbeks need to decide what form of governance works for Uzbeks, right? I think that, you know, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, brilliant. This new generation that's coming through, you've got this week, Minister Kamilov as Maslahatchi to President Mirziyoyev. He understands, he's worldly. But you have these mixtures of generations and expertise. I see cultural engagement from the MFA in ways that I have not seen before. So I see so many changes from 1994 that I think is going to become a model for other Central Asian republics. I think that Turkey can understand something from what the Ataturk is doing. The relationship between Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan is very strong. But I remember the time, if I went to Shahi Mardan, my favorite place, beautiful place in Uzbekistan. Please don't send a lot of tourists to Shahi Mardan, okay? Please, for Markaka. Don't destroy Haji Ma'az for Markaka, okay? So, but to go to Shahi Mardan was tense in 1995. You had to go through a Kyrgyz checkpoint. The Kyrgyz and the Uzbeks and the Tajiks, very angry. Every time I would cross a border now in the 90s into Tajikistan through Hojan to go to Kokand, or Kokand to Tashkent, I had to go through Hojan in order on the bus, Avtobusta. So, it was very tense. There was real fear. You're being patient with me, Fikretka. When, as a young man getting on the Avtobus in Kokand to go to Tashkent, we get to Tajikistan. Everyone says a dua, Bismillah, Ar-Rahman Rahim. We're starting the bus, we're doing the journey, and the old ladies are giving me bread and feeding me because I'm a guest, mehman. And we get to Tajikistan and the bus stops. I'm looking around. Everyone says another prayer going into Tajikistan. So there was real fear in Tajikistan, and there was real fear across those borders. And I honestly thought that that would be the way in Central Asia for another 100 years. So what President Mirziyoyev has managed to do is, and Tokayev and leadership in Kyrgyzstan and leadership in Tajikistan, all of these republics have managed to do is to come together and say, we have to work together in order to be strong. So things are changing in a way that I think are a model, not just in Central Asia, not just in Turkey, but in other parts of the world. People can learn from this model. It's practical. It's conservative. People want to hold on to what it means to be Uzbek. I ask that if you're a nationalist, is to be a compassionate nationalist. My mother-in-law is Russian. She's in her 70s, and I'm sorry, Hafabulmine, she's never going to learn Uzbek. Okay? So if nationalism becomes attacking an old lady wanting to read a Russian in a menu, just, relax. This is a place, an ecumenical world. I have to remind those people, Qodiriy spoke Russian. Qodiriy won a medal for speaking Russian. Okay? This isn't saying I'm pro-Putin or pro-Russian. I could care less about that. What I care about is that Uzbekistan work in a way that I know in the deep heart of every Uzbek is compassion. And the heart of every Muslim is the idea of compassion and mercy. So I just ask that these hardcore nationalists I'm not saying that they should be pushed around by the Russian language or Russian culture. You still need to be strong and you need to be Uzbek, but you can be strong and compassionate at the same time. So I think that that's the model of Uzbekistan.
Mm-hmm.
And you have many languages in Uzbekistan. You have the Iranian Zamin. You have Afrasiab, right? You have Zoroastrianism, you have Buddhism, you have Islam, you have Bukharan Jews, you have Russian Orthodox. That is your strength. That is the model. If you can continue to do what they did in the 90s, right, is to keep conflict, ethnic conflict, religious conflict, and be a republic, a constitutional republic that allows for tolerance, you will have lived up to the idea of the Jadids, and you will be a symbol for other republics to follow, from Africa to Asia.
Dear Mark, you spoke about the civilizational role of Central Asia. You visit Tashkent and Uzbekistan frequently. When you look at modern Central Asia, what do you see? Is it a revival of identity or the erasure of differences?
That's a good point. That was the question that I really struggled when you sent me the questions. I really struggled to think about how to answer that. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and Nashville is the publishing music center of America. Taylor Swift lives in Nashville. She doesn't live all the time in New York or Los Angeles. This is the home of American music. But my city is changing. They're building skyscrapers, big buildings. Everyone's running around. The traffic is terrible in Nashville. Things are changing, and it's not the same city that my parents moved to here in the 90s. The same experiences people are having in Tashkent with urbanization. Honestly, I miss a tramway. I miss taking a tramway. The Zaloni market. My wife and I married at the Zaks on Babur Kuchasa. And we got married, and I took her to the Zaloni market on Shota Rustaveli. And we bought a watermelon, and I bought her some flowers, and we went on our honeymoon. That market is no longer there. I told my wife, it's now a big building. In my opinion, and this is going to anger people, but they're destroying Shota Rustaveli. If I want to see a big building without features, I could just see that in Nashville. That's not interesting to me. But that said, the Soviet buildings are falling apart. Things change. The world changes. My wife said the other night, there's so much illegal wiring in these buildings from the Soviet period that to modernize Tashkent, you have to tear some things up in order to do it. So how do you keep Tashkent, yet modernize it at the same time, right? So what I'm trying to say with the Jadids is their world was changing. Qodiriy's world was changing. In 1924, as you know, they created the Uzbek SSR. They created the borders from Kazakhstan to Uzbekistan, which created all of these problems, right? So in Qodiriy's own period, in the Jadid's own period, the world was changing. They wanted modernization. They wanted reform. They wanted islahat. But at the same time, I think with Qodiriy in Kunlar, he started the book and finished the book. He finished the book in 1926, right? Started writing it 1922, 1923. Over this period of time, major changes occurred in his lifetime. There was the Russian Civil War, a bloody civil war in that period. There was the Basmachi, right? There was famine, there was starvation, there was disease in Central Asia. And then all of a sudden there were these new borders. So the experience that the Jadids were experiencing in the 20s are the same experiences that we are all experiencing. It gets back to that original idea that good literature is universal. There is no difference between Shakespeare and Chopin. Fark Yokekan. So there's no difference, right? So to kind of answer your question, you always have to decide right now what is considered tradition. What is considered important. It's kind of funny. People are again going to be angry at me. Like when I see these videos of Uzbek toys now, and all the dancing that goes on, like, my God, what is this? But I'm an old man now. Things are going to change, and young people are going to decide what traditions they want to hold on to, what's important and what is not going to be important. It's kind of like a wave, a tolkien, a wave. Tradition flows and it ebbs. Qodiriy was trying to, I think, in my opinion, in the 20s, to preserve this idea of what it meant to be Central Asian. He spoke Russian, he studied in Russia, but also he wanted to define what his heritage was, what his traditions were, what is important and what is not important. And in some ways, because he went to a madrasa, in some ways, I disagree with a lot of early Jadid scholars. I think he was a devout Muslim. I think many of the Jadids were devout Muslims. Some were, some weren't, maybe, right? Mm-hmm. It's just like any movement. And so, did Qodiriy maybe drink a little bit of alcohol? Maybe. Maybe at one point in his life, he was a little bit like Usta Alim, right? Maybe at one point in his life, he was closer to Uzbek Haji, right? So what he's telling you is that tension between change and tradition, and we have to decide what is important and what is not important. I think that, the thing that bothers me most about Tashkent is probably the traffic and the way people drive. I've almost been hit twice on Ivliva, on Shatra Rustaveli in Ivliva. A young man almost ran me over one night. What am I going to do? I get killed in Tashkent and someone has to call my wife and say, come get Mark. So, for me, I wish Tashkent would slow down a little bit and really think that, okay, we want to modernize this thing, but let's slow down on the development. There's plenty of money to be made. If you want to build a new building, you can build it somewhere else. Why do you have to build it in a mahalla? So I would argue respectfully, because we do need new buildings in Tashkent, is for developers, for the Hakimiyat, for people just to slow down and say, this isn't a race. What are you trying to win with this? Are you really trying to tell people that you cannot have your traditional mahalla anymore? Mm-hmm. Really?
Really?
Okay, then the Soviets won. Are you telling me that the Soviets planned a better city than you? So I think that they should slow down and say, look, I'm compassionate to these developers. They want to make money. They want to develop the city. Business is good. I'm an American capitalist. If you're not making money, you're being robbed. But what sort of leadership model are you presenting people? Are you a Jadi or are you Hamid boy? Which one are you? Right? Mm-hmm. So slow down a little bit. Let's think about what it means to be Uzbek and what it means to have tradition. I come from a very strong Arizona cowboy ethic. My word is my honor. I will try to be as honest with you as you are with me. Uzbekistan actually looks a lot like Arizona. So when I arrived at 24 and looked at Tashkent or looked out into the desert, especially out in Horizm and parts of Fergana, it made me homesick for Arizona. I wanted Mexican food, you know, and so there's a lot of similarities in all of that. And so, you know, so I'm constantly evaluating what my traditions are. How do I hold on to that cowboy ethic of honor and truth and being good?
Mm-hmm.
We're also killers, you know. We're also not afraid to fight. So I identify with Uzbeks. You know, like I've met some very honest people, you know, and there's some very similarities between that cowboy Uzbek Mehmon Dust
Mm-hmm.
sort of mentality, you know. So that's a long question, a long answer for a question. But that question really, the past couple of days, I've been thinking a lot about it. You know, but I think the short answer is the Jadids were trying to hold on to Uzbekness and Tajikness and to be Central Asian, hold on to that identity in the face of the Soviets.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Soviet Union was changing things that was alienating people. You no longer felt like you were home anymore, right? So, you know, Uzbekistan, as it does reform and as it makes changes, you know, I'm most interested in what happens with the creative economy in Uzbekistan in terms of what that does to tradition. You know, you're taking something, you know, Hurman Chalik, you know, these wonderful artists and rug weavers and miniaturists and potters and all of these things, and you want to create this into an economy, right? But when you make it into economy, there's stuff that you're changing tradition to sell it to a tourist.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how will that change Uzbek identity, right? So, you know, they just announced the creation of tourism in the creative economy. And I really want them to slow down and really think about what that means. You know, what you're doing to tradition. You know, is a knife from Chust going to still be a Chust knife if you change it to something that people from Chust don't use, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't want to buy a tourist, excuse my language, some shitty tourist Chust knife. I want to buy a Chust knife from Chust, made by a Chust master. That's, as an American, I want to bring this home. I still have one from 20 years ago. The thing's as sharp as a razor still. Mm-hmm. You know, it's the best knife that I own. You know, so, you know, if you do a creative economy, are you going to let guys like Mark Reese sell his book in the airport? You know, is this just, you know, so there's that Soviet mentality that still lingers. The government doesn't have to control everything. You know, if the government controls the creative economy, it is not a creative economy. Mm-hmm. It's a Soviet economy, right? Yeah. So I'm just asking respectfully to people, businessmen, government types, creative types. If you're in the creative economy, there'll be two types of art that you do. Art that you sell to tourists and art that you do from the heart. Those are two separate things. I want something from the heart. I don't want the tourist crowd, right?
We talk about the Jadids, about Islam, about the East, the Turkic world, and civilization. You often mention the Turkic world. My question to you is, how do you understand the Turkic world? Is it a model of governance based on Turkic values and traditions? How do you see it?
I think that you all are inventing the Turkic world as we speak. Uzbekistan joining the Turkic Council was brilliant. You know, if you go to Istanbul, people are still fighting about what is the Ottoman Empire. You know, but if we get past those little regional concerns, you're seeing a model of leadership with the Turkic Council, which is something that I really respect a lot. I think that these guys, this tradition, I met the Ustaz Hoja Ulu during the Jadid conference, Timur Hoja Ulu, a lovely man, a Dabli Odam. And I think about his tradition, going all the way back to the Jadids, and how these generations of men and women kept this idea of a Turkic Zamin, a Turkic people, as a unified force. The Soviets called it pan-Turkism. I don't think they understood what that meant. Okay. But the Turkic Council in Uzbekistan joining the Turkic Council and them coming together to discuss, okay, now what will we do now? What will we be? What does it mean to be a Turkic people, a unified Turkic people? They've now included Hungary into that model, right? So I tell a lot of my friends, well, up until the 17th to 18th century, the Ottoman Empire was the most powerful military force in Europe. They were a European power, as much as they were a Middle Eastern power, but they were a European power. We know this from the Ottoman archives. We know this from Ottoman history. You go to India and you cannot escape the Timurids. I would argue that Xinjiang is another Turkic republic. Southern Russia, and so when you mean Turkic to me, I start to think about Siberia. I start to think about Buryatia. I start to think about Western China, down to India, over to Europe, Hungary, and to Turkey. I start to think about the doner kebab in Nashville, Tennessee that I'm probably going to eat today. So the Turkic world is everywhere, and now these leaders have come forward and said, "What will we do now?" And that has not been done since the 1920s. Stalin tried to kill it, but it survived. And now this discussion is to occur. I would do anything to sit in on the Turkic Council and just listen, just to be a student. I have nothing to say. They're a stars, but I would love to learn from people like that,
Dear Mark, let me continue this conversation. Could you tell us, please, what does the revival of traditions, customs, and culture of Eastern peoples, and especially Uzbekistan, mean to you? It seems that for the next 500 years, the historical pendulum is shifting back to the East, back to the Islamic world. How do you see this process? What is your understanding of it?
I have to say, Mr. Shabanov, these are some of the best questions I've ever had since coming out with Bygone Kunlar. Really. Thank you for just taking the time and thinking through some. Honestly, I get these questions about Bygone Kunlar, the same ones, Kamush, Zainab, they're the same questions over and over again. And it's a little insulting when you're being interviewed to get the same questions over and over again. And, so you took time to really think this out. 500 years from now, I have no idea. I'm worried about the environment, honestly. They say the Christian joke is that man plans, God laughs. And anything that we plan right now is completely irrelevant unless we deal with environmental concerns. It is an existential crisis. We will not be here 500 years from now if we do not deal with environmental issues. And so that gets into planning the city of Tashkent, and modernizing Uzbekistan. And, the president just this week announced environmental health concerns as one of the top priorities. And thank you. My mother-in-law lives in Churchi. You're worried about my mother-in-law, and my respiration when I go to Tashkent. So if we survive 500 years as the human race, yes, the world is in my opinion, moving east. China is a force to be reckoned with. They are the 500-pound gorilla in the room. America is a 500-pound gorilla. What Americans do is we create things. We create new things that people want. But China is beginning to challenge that, in terms of productivity and the whole nine yards. But I also think, I worked at the Naval Academy, as I was in a leadership position as the Naval Academy. I think as the U.S. Navy challenges China in the Pacific, Japan, Korea, Australia, Vietnam, the United States, Great Britain, France start to challenge China in the Pacific and the South China Sea, they will start to move inward. They will continue to move into Central Asia.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not all that interested in politics. I'm interested in the Uzbek people. Okay, so if America is wrong about something, we're wrong. I'm critical of how we handled the former Soviet Union in the 1990s. I'm critical of America ignoring Central Asia for 20, 30 years.
What's problem? What's problem? America ignores.
Yeah, good question. Two-sided. I don't think Uzbekistan has represented them well. They have not done soft power effectively. It's always palav and it's always dances. Okay, I'm sorry, huffable mind. I'm sick of this shit. Could you guys do something else? For the same reason the Chinese make fun of American embassy parties, we always serve barbecue at these parties.
Yes.
Barbecue is smoky meat. My wife hates barbecue.
And to live in New York, suffering.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No culture. Excuse me.
Yeah. So, but how do we present American culture? How does Uzbekistan present American culture, or Uzbek culture abroad? Yes. And I think that a lot of the stereotypes of Uzbeks and Kazakhs and Kyrgyz and all these things are old Soviet stereotypes that have been transmitted to the United States.
Of course.
I've met important American policymakers that thought that Uzbek was a Slavic language. Okay, they did not understand that Uzbek was a Turkic language. And these were people who make important decisions about Uzbekistan. It was about 10 years ago. So now is the time for Uzbekistan to engage in serious soft power. And my criticism would be, is if you're going to engage in America, you need to hire Americans.
Mm-hmm.
All right. When I managed translation task orders, contracts, to translate into Bahasa Indonesian, Arabic, Hindi, Urdu, Brazilian Portuguese, Spanish, you name it, I didn't hire Mark Reese. Okay, I hired someone from Brazil. I hired someone from Latin America, someone from Indonesia, and so it's what I call in English the inside out point of view. Mark Reese will always understand Arizona cowboy ethic more than anybody in Uzbekistan.
Understand.
I don't care how long you've lived in Arizona. All right.
Understand.
So Mark can go to Uzbekistan for 30 years. Right. But I will never understand Fergana or Sufism like Rafshad Mavlan Kuma from the Kokam Urda from the museum. It is his soil. Right. So the problem is with this understanding is that you get smart ass Americans like me showing up and advising the U.S. government. All right. And not getting the Uzbek point of view across. Right. And then you have, Uzbeks doing soft power abroad, not understanding the demographic of who they are approaching. I don't know if that makes sense or not. So there's a lot of work to be done, and how do we understand each other? I think translation is at the core of this. And to be honest with you, I hope 10, 20 years from now, the English phrase is that you have to kill your heroes. You have to kill your hero. So I hope 20, 30 years from now, there are Uzbeks who say, you know what, Mark Reese's Kunlar, it's old. There's my way of interpreting Kunlar. Tolstoy has been translated a dozen times into English, right? Mm-hmm. So what Uzbekistan needs to do is a massive amount of scale. Remember Turkey in the 1970s, there was a movie, I can send it to you. It's called Midnight Express. Okay. Oliver Stone's first film, Midnight Express. It made the Turks look like pederasts in this movie. It was an unbelievably insulting movie to Turkey. And I remember in graduate school, I asked a Turk, a student, a fellow Hamkasp, Sinif Dosh, I said, what do you think about Midnight Express? He became very angry. Like, Mark, if you are my friend, you will never bring up this film again. Okay. Mm-hmm. So in the 70s and 80s, nobody really understood Turkey in America, right? But now they're producing their own image, right? They've completely transformed themselves. So Uzbekistan has to do a Turkey-level scale of soft power, not by hiring people from Istanbul, right? But by hiring people from the United States. Not Steven Seagal. Americans hate Steven Seagal. Okay. Yeah. So, you need to bring Americans with real views, British with real views, French with real views. It's happening, so, getting back to the original question, your people watching this are going to think I'm crazy talking like this.
Okay.
But, getting back to this mutual understanding, 500 years from now and tradition should, what I love about Islam is it's very simple. Mm-hmm. The Prophet Muhammad, praise be unto him, a very simple set of guidelines to follow throughout your life. Right? If you follow Ijma in Uzbekistan, if you follow Ijma in America, the idea that the community cannot agree upon a mistake, right? So with tradition and understanding, decide who you are and learn how to tell that story within the American context or the Chinese or the Russian context.
Thank you very much, dear Mark. Many foreigners are coming to Uzbekistan nowadays. Often, Uzbeks don't understand why these people are coming. You are a foreigner, but in many ways, you are already part of this society. What is Uzbekistan to you personally? Is it a country to study, a region to research, or is Uzbekistan for you an ancient civilization?
Yes. You wake up one day and you've been doing it for 30 years. The young man that left in my 20s, I've never lost my wonder of the place. But, when 9/11 occurred and the Twin Towers went down, I thought about my brother and his family because they were in New York. They moved to New York September 10th, 2001. And the next day, 9/11 occurred. But the first thing I thought about was Uzbekistan. I knew that it had to have been something that came out of Afghanistan, Al Qaeda, whatever. But I immediately became concerned. And, I've fought for Uzbekistan. As much as fighting for America, I fought for Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. I knew that Americans are provincial. We are one language. Americans know one language. I wouldn't say they read a lot. We're not very worldly, generally speaking, as a population. And I knew that if the U.S. military was going to come to Uzbekistan, into Afghanistan, Americans would not understand Central Asia at all. Zero. They had prejudices against Islam, against Muslims. There was a severe distrust. It was a tragic moment. Islam Karimov opened up a base for us, which had never happened in the former Soviet Union. Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, U.S. military bases in the former Soviet Union. It was a massive amount of trust that Islam Karimov showed us, right? But I know my people. I know American Kishlakskis, okay? And I know how they act. And so I decided, Mark, you need to be a Tarjimon. You need to be the guy who explains to American Uzbeks. So for example, women working on the military base at K2, I would look at my fellow Americans and say, you cannot speak that way to a woman in Uzbekistan. Okay. Her father, her mother, her brothers, her family is letting her work on this base. You are a diplomat representing America. And if you will not show hurmat, get the fuck out of here. Excuse my language. So almost every aspect of the past 30 years, Adabiyat Shanos, Din Shanos, Tarjiman, I've participated in combat operations in Afghanistan. I've done almost every aspect of Uzbek society. So at one point, maybe in graduate school, it was something to be studied and to understand. But I try to go to Tashkent once or twice a year. If I have free time, I always go to Kokan. Always. Kokan is my city. Istanbul and Kokan. Gapyo. Okay. So, you wake up 30 years, 31 years later, it's your life. It's Uzbekistan's my life. I've given my entire professional career to the place. I want to see things go well.
Mark, the next two questions concern both you and me. I grew up in Tashkent. Uzbekistan is my homeland. By passport, I'm a citizen of Azerbaijan, but Uzbekistan meaning Tanimdir. Uzbekistan is part of me. My question is, both you, Mark, and I, Fikrat Shabanov, live between two worlds. You, between American and Uzbek life, me, between Uzbek and Azerbaijani life. What have you taken from one culture and given to the other? What have you carried with you from one world into the other?
South, and this is similar to the cowboy tradition of adab. That is the thing that I recognize with Central Asians and Arizonans and Southerners. Nashville is a literary city. When we're drinking coffee in Nashville, we talk about what book we're reading. Okay, so in October, I'm going to host Central Asian literature in Nashville at this massive literary festival. And I know that Nashvillians will come and look, there's Uzbek literature, Azeri literature, I don't know. They're going to want to read this new literature that they don't know anything about. Why? Because Nashvillians are Southern gentlemen. Being adab, being polite is the number one thing that is most important to us. I do not like Kupal adab says Odamlar. Yamon Kordaman.
Thank you, Mark.
But you know what Central Asia gave me was a whole other level of adab. I showed up thinking, man, Odab, Leodam, and then I met Uzbeks. And then I thought, my God, so Uzbekistan has given me a whole other level of adab. Central Asia, there's a restaurant that I love in Beyoğlu in Istanbul, Aheste. I love this restaurant in Beyoğlu. And I go and I went there the first time. It's hard to get a reservation. And then I wrote them again. I said, I'd like to come again. This was so good, such good food. Can I get a small table? And I walk in and the lady who runs this restaurant goes, Mark, merhaba. She remembers me. And I think that that is something that Uzbekistan has that America does not have. Okay, I'm looking out through my window right now at my neighbors, and I speak to them maybe 1 or 2 times a year. Okay,
Okay.
in Uzbekistan, I cannot come to Tashkent with saying hello to people, right? So that's what Uzbekistan's given me. It's given me an understanding of faith. It's given me adab. You guys are experts in Central Asia on adab. Adabiyat, it's given me my wife. So it's given me my sons, so it's given me basically my entire narrative. What I like to think I give Uzbekistan is number one is to show that there's an American who cares. There are Americans who know Uzbekistan, who know Central Asia, and we love it. To be honest with you, over a 20-year period, American experts, they were always called spion. Why is this American wanting to learn about us? He must be working for the government. No, I think that people who have that perspective think very low of their own culture. Right. When they say that the foreigner who loves Uzbekistan is a spion, they're saying that their culture is not good enough to know. Right. There must be some other agenda going on. Right. So, but I've stuck with Uzbekistan because of adab and because of diniyat and because, I've got my dear friends in Tashkent that they're some of my best friends that I've had in my lifetime. But Mark Reese has his own perspective. I want to challenge old Soviet methodology in ways of thinking about the world. Sometimes Uzbeks don't like criticism. They can be very sensitive to criticism. I think that comes from the Soviet period. The way the Soviets treated Central Asian and Caucasus people, there's kind of this inferiority complex. But culturally, in Arizona, being honest with someone and direct with someone is showing hormat. Okay. Being direct and saying, do you think maybe you could change this? Maybe you could do that. Giving an honest opinion is to show hormat, right? I don't go into the hakim or the rector's office or the head of the mahala and tell them, that's bullshit. Okay. Yes. So you come into my office to bullshit me. Okay. Yeah. No, that's Boo Hormat says. All right. If you're a man, you look somebody in the eye and you're saying, Hormat Balan, Iltamas, I want to give you my honest opinion. I am not going to waste your time with lies, right? Yes. And you may fire me. So if I ever worked for someone, I don't work for anyone in Tashkent, but if I ever worked for a company or an executive or an organization to consulting and advising, the first thing I'll say to them is, listen, I live in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm from Arizona. I'm going to be very direct with you. Okay, because I respect you, right? As a leader, and you didn't hire me to lie to you, right? You don't want to hire a Yogonchi. You want to hire someone who tells you the truth. And so I try to bring that. I try to bring a little bit of Nashville rock and roll, relax. One of the things I would love to do in Tashkent, I want to make Utgan Kunlar into an audiobook. And I want to have it broadcast in Tashkent for kids to listen to English. I would love to have an hour of the radio in Tashkent where I can play American music. Nothing with bad words, no bad language, okay, is Uzbek culture, but just some American rock and roll or some American country or blues or jazz or all of these different things. So I think it's the first responsibility I want to remind Uzbeks is that if you want to be a great civilization, if you want to project your culture 500 years from now, you need to be open. You need to allow people to come and do business, protect them, make money in Tashkent. That's what the Ottoman did, right? The Ottomans lasted for 700 years because they understood you needed to have foreigners. Chinggis Khan understood. Timur understood. You protect the artisans. You protect the intellectuals. You want those different perspectives to come and teach you. And then you will teach them in the same thing. So I think that when Uzbekistan was closed, it was damaging to Uzbekistan because there was less Mark Reeses. You need to make it easy for the Mark Reeses of the world to come and learn. I am your best diplomat in America, right? So I want to bring cowboy Sufism, Nashville culture to Uzbekistan,
Yes.
and say, Kabul Kilasis, Kabul Kilmesis, accept, don't accept, but you'll know what my perspective is.
Okay.
Mark, it's been a real pleasure talking with you. And honestly, I don't want this conversation to end, but we are running out of time. This will be my final question. Right now, because of economic difficulties, many young people are thinking about leaving the country in search of better financial opportunities, chasing what we call the long dollar. But in reality, the real loss doesn't begin with money. It begins with losing your own culture and history. What would you say to young Uzbeks who feel embarrassed or insecure about their culture? What would you say to help them understand what the world really is, what it means to be Uzbek, and what true civilization means? Please, Mark, your final words.
You know, look, I've met Uzbeks from Uzbekistan in Afghanistan. Okay. They started out with the Tajik Civil War. They went down to Afghanistan to fight. And you ask them why. Why did you do this? Now you're talking with me. All right. You know what your mother in Namangan, what is she gonna say? Right, to see her son here right now. And they'll say, you know, I did it for money. I started out with this fight for money. And the second thing is pride. Because I could be a fighter and I can send money home to my mom and dad and I can say that I am a man, right? So when you take, I really believe dignity and respect is the number one leadership principle. And, you know, you got to ask yourself, I just said about being honest to leadership. I'm going to be honest now. You know, what Uzbekistan's got to ask themselves, why do these people leave? Do they leave just because of money or do they leave because of dignity and respect? Because I've met young men who are willing to kill for dignity and respect. It became a business. Yes, they'd make money, but there's dignity and respect involved in that, right? So how do you make young men, you know, have dignity and respect? And I'm ignoring women as well. You know, you got to show women respect. You know, my friend Nazima Davlatova, who's done women rights abuse, I'm telling you, I'm 220 pounds. I'm a cowboy. I can still at 56 kick most people's asses. I do not respect a man who disrespects women. Don't even invite me to Osh, if that's your opinion of women, right? Uzbek tradition, oymulas, you know, it's called onatilla. You know, women have an important place in Uzbek society. And if you there's a saying from Africa, if you strike the woman, you strike the rock that you stand on. Translate that. If you strike the woman, you strike the rock. So I don't have any respect for men who take their strength, their physical strength, their mental strength, and abuse women with it. Zero hormat. Okay. So, but you got to ask yourself, what drives a man to abuse somebody that is weaker than them? I want to remind people the Prophet Muhammad, praise be unto him, one of the first things he did was end the practice of infanticide of females, the murdering of female babies. He ended that. He had a special relationship with women. And so if you want to be a good Muslim, be a good Muslim, but don't take the Andrew Tate masculine bullshit, okay, and say that that's Islam. Not to me, not to my face. Okay. So I get a little angry about this, right? So, young men, but the system in Uzbekistan has to ask themselves, do young men feel that they're getting dignity and respect? Because that lack of dignity and respect leads to negative consequences. Okay. If I was to sit those young men down and say, you know what, if you want to fight, join the Uzbek military. If you want to fight, stay here and try to improve the system. Leadership has to listen to you. One of my personal view is that President Mirziyoyev is very serious about reform, that these are not window dressings. I'm not sure about the middle managers. I know that the president is serious. I am not certain that leadership at the middle level is serious about reform or serious about keeping dignity and respect. I saw a film for Bandajan where a leader gets out of the car and people are chanting for his arrival and everything. Yuck. I worked for an admiral in Viney Morskoy Float, a very powerful man who did very serious work. He never disrespected me like that. He could have said anything to me. He never said, Mark, I want you to chant when I come into work. That's bullshit. Excuse my language. So these men that go abroad, these people go abroad, are they going for money? Yes. Are they going for dignity and respect? Also, yes. Right? So that said, Fergana, you want Uzbeks to go abroad. You want them to go abroad. You want Uzbeks to travel, in my opinion. I think that MFA people need to get out and see real America. They get to see Washington, D.C., but you and I both know that New York City and Washington, D.C. are not America. Right? Just as Tashkent is not entirely Uzbekistan.
Yes,
right?
Yes, of course,
right?
Of course.
So you want Uzbeks to become internationally minded. You want to help them do that. You want them to go to American, Chinese, Russian. I don't care. I don't care about politics. I care about Uzbeks going abroad, becoming internationally. And how do you get them to come back to Uzbekistan? Right? One of the ways that you get people to come back, and there have been times, honestly, over the past 6 years, frustrated with change in Tashkent and Uzbekistan, I've thought many times about quitting and saying, I'm 56 years old. It's been 30 years and nobody is helping me in Tashkent. I finally have a good publicist, Akbar Tashtomorov, who's printing copies of Ukan and Kunlar in Tashkent. But it is damn hard for an American to do business in Tashkent. I'm not worried about big American corporations. What about the middle guys like me, normal people? Can I make $1 in Uzbekistan? Are you going to tax me 35% if I make $1 in Tashkent? So it's all about dignity and respect. And I don't feel like in the past 6 years, I've been really respected in Tashkent at times. The only conference I went to that I really felt respected was the Jadid conference.
Yes.
That Nazima and Saida did. And then there was one in Namangan, the guy who managed it, Timur, a very good tourism professional, and he tried really hard. But so these are not necessarily just economic questions. What I love about your questions is that it gets back to tradition. It gets back to the human. What do you believe in? what are the leadership principles that you believe in? I think that you're being patient with me, and I know you're running out of time. But if Bygone Kunlar is the first full-length Uzbek novel, in the Uzbek language, and he writes about the massacre of the Kipchaks, is Qodiriy really talking about human rights, the dignity of human beings? That you can be a Kipchak, you can be a Kyrgyz, you could be a Kara Kyrgyz, you could be a Tajik, you can be an Uzbek, you can be a Kazakh, but I am never going to deny you the basic dignity and respect of you being you. Right? So that's what the big leadership challenge is. I see President Mirziyoyev all the time acknowledging people he does not have to acknowledge. Okay, he greeted a handicapped girl the other day to give her an award, a Yoshlik award, right? And he gave her a hug. Affable mind, but I don't quite remember President Karimov being that accessible, that warm, right? So Mirziyoyev has got this human face. He does things that he does not have to do, right? Yet you see some guy in the provinces get a drum group to play, Karnai, Sarnai, look, I'm coming to work in the morning. I'm like, what? Are you the Han? Stop. You're embarrassing your nation when you do that. So the tradition, the leadership question goes all the way back to the Jadids. Dignity and respect, insonin hukuklade, insoniat, adabiyat. Those are the things that young men should have in their heart. They are strong. Uzbek boxers, gap yo. We know you can fight. I met you in Afghanistan. I know you can fight. All right. You're not afraid to fight. Okay. You're strong, right? Take that strength. Your strength should be not hitting women, not hitting people that are weaker than you, but lifting them up and putting them in the place, right? So that is the thing that they should be proud of. And it's not an American idea. It's a human idea. And the Jadids embodied that idea.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Thank you. It's my dear brother, beautiful
My brother.
Mark Reese. My brother Jadid Mark Reese. You're welcome.
Tashkent borganimda biz choy ichamiz. Maylimi?
Mayli, ne zaman gelirsen? Ne vaqt?
Oh, okay. Bakuga borsam biz supraflashamiz.
Tamam. Benim kardeşim Jadid Mark Reese.
Rahmat. Vaqtingiz uchun kattakon rahmat.
Rahmat sizga, salomat bo'ling, omon bo'ling.
Salomat bo'ling. Gaplashamiz.
Rahmat. Mayli.